Welcome, everyone. I'm Justin Silverman of the New England First Amendment Coalition. Thank you for joining us for another round of open government lessons. During this class, you'll learn how to work outside the public records law in your state to get the documents you need. Maybe you made a public records request and were denied. You appealed the denial and again were told that the records you need are off limits. Meanwhile, your deadline is looming and a story needs to be told. What can you do when your state's public records law doesn't work in your favor and you find yourself out of options? We'll soon hear how reporter Annmarie Timmins answered that question. If you haven't already, please view our previous classes on public records, open meetings, and state court systems. The lessons they provide are all cumulative, starting you off with the basics and then gradually addressing more and more nuanced areas of the law and journalism practices. The classes are state-specific and provide practical step-by-step lessons you won't find anywhere else. You can find them all in our FOI guide at nfac.org and on our YouTube channel, 5 Freedoms. Before we begin, I want to recognize the estate of Gloria L. Negri for its support of these classes. Gloria was a trailblazing journalist at the Boston Globe for more than 50 years. This program is part of her legacy of newsroom education and her lifelong commitment to local journalism. You can learn more about Gloria and other NEFAC supporters at nfac.org/supporters. During today's presentation, I encourage you to introduce yourself in the chat and share your own experiences and resources. You can also use the chat or the Q&A button to ask questions of our instructor, and we'll get to as many of those questions as possible. Annmarie, all yours.
Thanks for tuning in. I really like this program. I want to echo what Justin said. The recordings on the NEFAC website, I have found them really helpful, especially when I'm trying to do something in another state, a New England state, which we all sometimes have to do. It's just been really helpful. So I encourage you to take advantage of that. Okay, so records requests, it can take forever. We work on deadline and sometimes we don't have forever. Often we don't. So what I want to talk to you about is ideas to get around that, or I think of it as preventative healthcare to avoid a record request altogether if you can. So both to avoid, but then if you get stuck, what can you do? So the first and foremost thing is sources are people. Just like you and me, they have things they like, they don't like, they have people they like better than other people. And so you want to get on the list of they like you better than other people. And really don't underestimate the little things. And you probably know this, it's how we interact with friends, but I feel these are my secret tools that I use to really build sources. I ask about their vacation. I call them to check in to see how they're doing when I don't need anything. There's a state rep, Republican state rep, who's going through the online dating process after losing his spouse. She died a couple years ago. I check in to see how that's going. Around Thanksgiving time, I send an email to the PIOs that I've bothered the most for the year and really ask for a lot of information and a lot of interviews. Sometimes I will be digging up information that someone else in my story that I've talked to would really love to see. And so when I can, I will share that with them, or I'll share with them a response I've gotten, maybe from the state, both to get their reactions to it, but because I also know that they wanted to do it. And there's some boundaries I put, don't share this until after I've published, or don't tell anyone I shared this. So sort of sometimes it's a transactional relationship in that way. I try to really set reasonable deadlines because it just goes a long way to them wanting to work with you. So if I know I'm working on a story the next day or later down the week, I will tell them that I'm going to be calling you on Wednesday for this information. Are you going to be in? Is this going to work for you? If I can push it, would another day make it more likely you could help me with that information? And I'll talk more about this piece later. I do a lot of the little stories, the ones we don't include for clips when we're applying for a job, teeny tiny stories. And that I don't make up news, but often these things are like kind of news and they can go into your publication. And those go a long way to building relationships, both with people who they're about, but also the people who care about what that group is doing. And I've generated a lot of good sources from that. And this is another big one. Respond to those emails that arrive in all capital letters, where I got one the other day. It began with, "You are a disgrace," all caps, lots of exclamation points. Someone was happy with a photo that I chose for a story on a read-in at the State House. It was sort of a book ban. People were sitting on the ground reading their books. That was the only photo to get. This person did not like it. I respond to angry emails anyway, but this person is someone I'm going to need to talk with going forward. And she did not expect me to respond. And I often find this to be true. In another case, a state rep didn't feel that I had quoted her correctly on an issue involving the potential elimination of the Child Advocate Office. And I learned this because she had blasted me on Twitter on the New Hampshire Journal, another outlet's website or Twitter feed. So I just reached out to her and said, "I'm so sorry that you felt I misquoted you. I really want to talk this through." In radio, you have the tape. So I had the tape and she knew I was recording her. So I hadn't misquoted her, but she didn't like the story. I think it's one of those cases where she didn't really like how she came off. And maybe that was the problem. But that conversation, I think I hope helped getting her back on my good side, because I really need her to get information. So this is the hard part I have found. This process starts from the beginning every time you start a new beat. And that I always think, is it going to work? Can I still do this? And so that is always a stress for me. So this next slide truly does relate to this presentation. 2 years, last month, a year ago, last week actually, I was in Vienna to see Taylor Swift. I had spent 2 years getting tickets, radio contest, all kinds of embarrassing, pleading, begging things to get tickets. And I finally was able to get tickets to Vienna. And the day I got there and the night before the show, a terrorist plot led to the show being canceled. And my phone blew up. And a lot of those messages were from sources saying, "Oh, I heard that and I immediately thought of you. I'm so sorry. Maybe better luck next time." I mean, I just couldn't believe the people that I heard from. And these were people from this new healthcare beat that I had started covering just, about a year before that. And so I guess what I want to leave you with on this part is that the efforts are not, they may feel small, but they go a long way. And I think they matter. So the Taylor Swift concert ended a very happy note, which I could answer questions about later if you wanted. Let's see. Okay, so I'm going to take you through 4 stories where I really had to rely on somebody else to get the information I needed. Susan Sarno was a woman who was assaulted by her estranged husband in 1993, and she was badly, badly beaten. He had come from Massachusetts, found her with her boyfriend, and beat her so badly. Now, at this time, domestic violence was considered a family matter, a private matter. The state did not have the kind of response it has now. It didn't have this domestic violence review committee. The police weren't trained in responding to it. And so we almost never wrote about it. And in this case, this will speak to that. The prosecutor and the judge agreed that a light sentence was justified in this case for the estranged husband. He got 29 days, and then the judge said, how about we do it on weekends? Would that be convenient for you so it doesn't cost you your job? And so it was really shocking. And I knew that the story was going to be the photo, because people had not seen domestic violence and we didn't write about it, and they didn't really know what that looked like. And so this photo looked better at the time, but it shows Susan with a gash on her face with many, many stitches. And that photo changed everything about domestic violence and how we respond to it in the state. I needed this photo quickly. The police had it. I could have filed a request. It would have taken a long time, I think, because it's unprecedented to release a photo like this at the time. And I didn't have a source in this police department. And like I said, I didn't have time to wait. And so I found someone, I had written a story about a few years earlier, like I was a baby reporter then, I only been at it 3 years, but I had found someone that I had written a story about in another sheriff's office. It was one of those like, so and so's been promoted today to new rank in the police department because they did this amazing thing. And so I still had that person's phone number. And I called them and said, is there anything you can do to help me get this photo? Because I think it's so important. And that person made a call for me and convinced the police chief in this town where this incident happened to release the photo to me. And out of that photo, the governor called together a task force to really rethink how we did responded to domestic violence in the state. Um, we have a task force now. Police make mandatory arrests when they go to a scene. And it really was Susan Sarno, this woman who also agreed to the police asked her, can we release this? And she had the sense to recognize what this photo, that is one of those true, like a photo is worth 1,000 words. And so getting that photo, I just would have never, I don't believe I would have gotten it through a true records request. So that tiny little story that I had written a year before um, led me to getting this photo. One thing I think is harder now than so I started 35 years ago, um, and I was a Concord Monitor reporter for a long time. There was no email then, there was no social media, there were no cell phones. So you had to do a lot of most all of your reporting in person. And that, I feel so lucky to have had that for so long because I find it harder to make connections, like meaningful connections through email. And since COVID, more and more people want to communicate with us that way. So you'll just have to find ways to still get back to this kind of old-fashioned meeting people in person. And I know we're on deadline all the time and it's hard, but it's so, so important because it's just hard to I don't know. I'm not going to tell someone about my Taylor Swift woes, getting tickets through an email. That's kind of like a comes up in conversation thing. So really, I'm sorry that you have to do that if you're sort of newer to the field. I recognize that it's much, much harder. So the next story, this is a Dennis Vaughn, was 5 years old. He was killed on Christmas Eve. He was I had never seen a abuse case this badly. And he was killed around the time that three other New Hampshire children had been killed. And we heard a lot about those other children. One was Harmony Montgomery, and that name may register with you. No one knew who Dennis Vaughn was. And someone called me that I had known from the Laconia Police Department from covering that community at least 15 years ago, had called and said, why is no one talking about this? You should look into that. And so some things were helpful. The mom of the boy filed a lawsuit against the state. That helped me get DCYF records, made that very easy. And those that we can't get. So that was really helpful. But I also wanted to hear the police calls from all the people over the years who had been calling the police department to say, I'm witnessing this boy being abused. I'm witnessing him being tied outside his grandmother's house in the cold. He came to school with bruises all over his body. And so I felt like hearing this tape, like the photo, was going to be more powerful than anything that I could put in print. And so someone in that police department, and I didn't know these existed. So someone in that police department said, you should ask for these things. And if you do, I'll I'll turn them around right away. So sometimes I'm filing right to know request, but it's a formality to give the person who's helping me kind of cover so they don't appear like they're feeding me information, even though that's what they're doing. And so this is a screenshot of what was in our paper. It was for the New Hampshire Bulletin where I was at the time, and people could click on that audio file and hear these distress calls to the police department that DCYF had failed and failed and failed to respond to. There was no investigation going on in this case, And I asked the governor about it repeatedly. He said, we're working on it. It's just it's a very hard case. We don't know when we'll get to it. And I feel like helping people hear what was going on, in addition to reading, really made a difference. And I wouldn't have even known to look for these recordings. I didn't know when they had happened over a span of 5 years. And so in this case, even if I knew, I think a records request, it just would have taken forever. And so getting these recordings made a real difference. Um, Out of that, the police had also tried to interview the grandmother who had custody of Dennis and his siblings at the time. And someone in the police department said she operates under an alias. And so I spent hours and hours on Facebook looking for her, and I found her on Marketplace selling things up in Maine. And I just messaged her, and over the course of a weekend, we exchanged 80 messages, and it was the only interview she had done, including with anyone, police included. And she just was very defiant that she hadn't done anything. She's now on trial for the homicide of Dennis. And I think our reporting and your reporting can make a real difference. And this is an example, but I think it was getting that audio recording of people calling the police station, because that's a primary source. People can't say we made it up. It's right there. And if not for knowing someone in the police department from 15 years prior, I wouldn't have been able to get that tape. I wouldn't have even known it existed. So again, it was thanks to someone I covered Laconia Police many, many years ago. Spent a lot of time with them in person on ride-alongs and going to the station, and I just think that paid off. Um, so this is a more recent case. This woman, Robin Alexander, had offered the state, some of you may remember this, offered the state $21 million for a piece of property in Laconia that was not worth $21 million. And when I heard what her plan was, it just seemed preposterous to me. It sounded like Disneyland. It was going to have a community dog park and an urgent care and 1,500 units of housing and assisted living and a zip line and snowmobile trails. And I just thought, sounds ridiculous. And so I just started looking into it and looking into her. And what I had realized was that the state had not vetted her at all. And she had a lot of problems. She had a history of unpaid taxes. She had a history of investors suing her for essentially taking their money. She had had multiple foreclosures. But the state, to me, was saying, everything is on track. We believe her completely. We have full faith in her. And I did a records request to the Department of Administrative Services, which was managing this deal. The last thing they wanted was this deal to go south. But the person in that office, I don't want to say who, said you should ask for emails between this date and this date between our office and everyone connected with this. And if you file that right to know request, I can get you those documents in 2 days. So, and they did, and I had hundreds of emails that showed that while the state was telling me they had full confidence, they were getting really upset and irritated with this buyer who had kept dragging her feet. And if not for that relationship I had had with the person with this office, I don't think I would have gotten those records. And my relationship with that person began because I had heard that they make 200 Christmas cookies and hand out over Christmas. And so we had a whole conversation with that. I checked back in to see if it was on schedule. It was just a fun conversation. You never know where these would lead, but it led to this, and it made a huge difference. And this person was an official in this office. Again, it wasn't going to help him for me to get this out. And in fact, he even sent me one internal memo by another person in the office it's very disparaging of me and how I was making this up to further my career. And it was all untrue. And that had been written for the executive council just to say, we have full confidence in this reporter who keeps writing about it is lying. And so to his credit, he even included that. He had pulled that before it went to the executive council. But again, it was this preventative healthcare theory that I have, that relationships get you around records request or make them a formality, which was the case here. Robin Alexander is now due to be sentenced in federal court next month. She eventually pleaded guilty to a charge, that was kind of a minor charge, but the plea agreement laid out everything that had been reporting all along. And I think it was just the publicity of this case that finally led the Secretary of State's office to look at potential securities fraud, and that's ultimately what brought her down. And so the state is now trying to sell this land all over again. And this was an important case because the governor, who also told me I was making this up, had rewritten, with the consent of the legislature, the law so that he could sell this land almost personally and go outside of the usual vetting process. He just needed 3 votes on the executive council. And so I think this just exposed some shenanigans in state government, really abdicating their responsibility to vet these projects, and just how bad she was and what a risk it would have been had they moved forward. And ultimately, this woman, Robin Alexander, did not come up with the money. People started withholding funding from her. She didn't even come up with close to the down payment. And so again, if not for this conversation, our relationship that began with talking about cookies at Christmas, I don't know that this would have happened. And so again, no conversation is too small. And of course, it has to be sincere. I'm sincerely interested in these cookies because I try to make 2 dozen at Christmas and find that overwhelming. So just another example how a conversation that can seem like a throwaway conversation can really lead to great returns later. And you never know when, but it can be years. And this last story is sort of ongoing. Andy Sanborn was a former state senator and owned a bunch of businesses in Concord. I had been writing about him for a number of years because he had kind of a shady bankruptcy situation. He justified sort of stiffing all the investors in a prior business because he had a terminal illness. That was many, many years ago. He keeps citing that as a reason he is running into problems with his business front. But during the pandemic, the Attorney General accused him of using over $800,000 in pandemic money to buy a Porsche or 2 and a Ferrari and do all these other things. But they still have not charged him. We're going on 2 years now, and they have never brought charges against him. And so I wondered, how closely had the state been watching this casino all along? But I didn't know what I didn't know. I didn't know if there were records of compliance checks. I didn't know how many, how to ask for them. So I had met someone, again, years ago covering a totally different beat. It was through the legislature, but I knew they had a sense of how lottery worked. And I called them and said, this is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to look at this casino versus how the state has been watching other casinos and whether there should have been a red flag there. And whether they overlooked something. And this source said, this is what you need to ask for. So I reached out to Lottery. I knew someone in that agency too, as it turned out, and I hadn't realized the person I knew had moved to that agency. And they also had some suggestions. So I finally filed a right to know law and asked for a lot of records. And the person who responded to my request said, I could give these to you. It's going to take 6 months. What are you looking for? And I told them what I just told you. And they said, I think we can narrow this down if you're agreeable to just these certain kind of compliance checks. And rather than looking at all dozen or so casinos, you might want to think about comparing him to the biggest casino in the state and one that's more along his size at the smaller end. And so with that, I found out that this person's record, they had been to this casino more than they had been to others. There wasn't anything glaring, so it wasn't a blockbuster story, but I think it was fair. If it was I think it was a fair question to ask, what has the state been doing in terms of looking at this casino and also just regulating casinos as we're in the process of expanding them? And in this case, it was another one of those, a source sent me to a source who had some ideas for me. And I think it was just my reputation as someone who's fair to keep up with stories and keep up with relationships along the way. So when I say write the little stories, I mean the little stories. So these, I went through all of my clips back to the beginning and looked at what I had been writing about because this is really when I started building sources. These are not amazing stories. A haircut fundraiser, the Grange gives an award, Canopy Lake Park turns 100, some Boy Scout built an elm tree, Vino's, a beloved Concord restaurant, was going out of business to make way for Walgreens. Again, these are stories that don't take much time, but they are an investment in your reporting later on, especially when you need to avoid a records request or you need some help narrowing it or knowing who to ask and getting those records returned to you much faster than you would under the regular process. Because as you know, the only thing an agency has to do is write back within 5 business days and say, we're working on it. And then after that, there's no deadline. I'm still waiting on some records requests that are they're older than a year, and it's just one agency I've not been able to really crack. So the little stories, I think they're fun, but a lot of people don't. But they're worth your time. And one other thing I just want to talk about in terms of building sources is they get you the kind of access you need to better understand the internal workings of a story that you want to write about. Um, these are all stories that someone helped me get into based on prior relationships and my reputation after 30 plus years. I can't make that go away. There we go. The 30 plus years of reporting in New Hampshire, it's a small state. Your reputation is in more places than you realize. And so I think of every single interaction I have as a chance to show what kind of person I am, what kind of reporter I would be, and also make a connection with someone. I'm never off duty. It's not unusual for me to get a call way after hours, on the weekend. I got a call around something that's big news right now at 9 o'clock on a Saturday. They had wanted to give me the exclusive story. And so that's all thanks to relationships. I'm not like an amazing investigative reporter. That's not my strength. My strength is these tiny little relationships that I grow. So this one over here on the left, this I wanted to go when Governor Sununu sent some troops down to the border to help Texas police the fence in Eagle Pass. I really wanted to go. I fully expected that to go nowhere, in large part because the governor had to agree. And I had not too long ago just written a year's worth of stories showing that neither he nor the state had vetted this buyer for the Laconia property. And to my surprise, he said yes. And so I got to go to Eagle Pass and spend 3 nights with the soldiers, really shadowing what they were doing there. And it was a really amazing experience. And I think a story that no one else was able to tell because we don't get close to the soldiers. We are always talking through a spokesperson. So to see them interacting with people, in this case, Lieutenant is talking with a woman using Google Translate to try to figure out what she wants. And sort of the humanity that they approach this job with is not something I really had thought much about. And it was only because my reputation had been as someone who was fair and not a gotcha journalist, that I was able to have this access, even with the approval of someone who couldn't have been very happy with me at the time. In another case, I really wanted, New Hampshire was thinking about getting rid of the death penalty. This was back in 2007. And so I wanted to go in and talk to as many people serving life without parole as possible. And so I was able to, I just wrote to every single person. The Department of Corrections helped me get the names of those people. I wrote a handwritten letter to each one of them, and several said that they would talk to me. They could call me collect, but I did not want to do that. We could have corresponded by mail. That wouldn't have been as meaningful. So because I had a good relationship with the agents, like the within the agency, the commissioner's office, I had some good relationships there. They let me go in and spend some time with these inmates, talking to them face to face. And in one case, it was a person with his brother who had killed their parents, and I was his first visitor ever. Because when you kill your parents, like your relationships are severed, and his brother was in a different prison. And so each one of these inmates told me, surprisingly, that they would have preferred the death penalty because life in prison is so torturous. And again, that wouldn't have been the same story if I could have even gotten to them um, through collect calls to me or writing. Just a couple others I'll talk about here. Up here on the right, Gene Robinson was the first openly gay bishop in the Episcopal Church to be up for election to be bishop in New Hampshire. He was a clergy person. And this was back in 2003. We've come a long way in terms of respecting um, people's, sexual identity, gay marriage, the whole bit. We're in a little bit of a rough patch now, but we've come a long way in this state. At this time, it was outrageous to people that an openly gay clergy person was going to be bishop in New Hampshire, someone who was married to another man. It just was impossible. So I traveled with him to Minneapolis to see how this was going to be the vote. There was a lot at stake. And I was able to convince him to let me sit with him and his husband and his daughter in a separate room, and we watched the count together. So was able to see the moment he learned whether he got the vote or not. And that was again doing tiny little stories about the church along the way, different things, and doing them in person and talking with Gene Robinson over a course of many months before we went to Minneapolis. And I think again, these relationships you build matter in so many ways that you can't imagine at the time. And just the last story I'll mention, I got a tip that there was a mummified baby in Concord that the Attorney General's office had confiscated. And of course, I wanted to talk to the owner of this mummy, but I could have filed the records. I think I did file a records request to see where this was, but it was under investigation. It was going to be forever before I got anything. So I knew someone at the Concord Police Department, and I said, just tell me the street in Concord where this mummified baby is. And because I had written stories about police promotions and did the police log in person all the time, I knew all the police officers, and they gave me the street. Thankfully, it was a pretty small street, and I knocked on every door to say, I know this is a weird question, but do you have a mummified baby, or do you know anything about it? And nobody did. And the last person I reached, his name was Charles Peavy, and he said, come in and I'll tell you the story. There's no way I was going to knock on every door in Concord. So without this tip, I wouldn't have been able to find him. And that was again just because I had a relationship that started out with a very, very small conversation many years prior. And the mummified baby in his mind was a relative that had been passed down for generations. And just at the end of the story, the state took it. It was going to bury it. They told Charles when to come, and they buried it several hours before so that he would miss the funeral. It was put in an unmarked grave, and a year later, it was dug up and has never been found. So it was a fun story, but also so glad I was able to get to that part of the story. And I wouldn't have if I didn't have the relationship. So maybe I'll leave it there. Just I don't know how I'm doing on time. Nobody asked about the Taylor Swift thing, but this was also a huge relationship um, bridge. We're standing in the t-shirt line. The woman behind us was super friendly. She lived in South Carolina. We exchanged phone numbers in case we could connect at the concert. We spent the week with her and her friends in Vienna after it was canceled. We all met in Stowe in February. I went to her house for Thanksgiving, and she got us all tickets to the Indianapolis show. So talk to people wherever you find them because those relationships return in big, big ways.
Annmarie, thank you so much for this lesson and all this valuable advice. Really appreciate your guidance and all the work that you do at NHPR. Many thanks to everyone else who joined us today. We provide these lessons as a public service to you, so please return the favor and encourage your colleagues and friends to join us. We have a lot to learn from each other, and I look forward to seeing you all again soon. On behalf of NEFAC, thank you. Thank you for all you do, and take care, everybody.